In 1970, there was a cut of beef that butchers could not sell. It sat in the case, and nobody reached for it. Some of them stopped charging for it at all. You would buy a roast, and they would drop this other thing in the bag for nothing, because the only other place for it was the barrel at the back of the shop at the end of the night. That same cut, today, costs more per pound than steak. The animal did not change. The recipe did not change. The price did. I am not going to tell you what it is. Not yet. Hold on to it, because the number on it now only lands once you know the number it used to carry, and here is the part that should stay with you. Whatever happened to that one cut of beef, you can watch the same thing happen to 9 other things sitting in your kitchen right now. The tail, the wings, the neck, the belly, the greens in the crisper drawer. So that is the promise. 10 foods, what they used to cost, what they cost today, and the question almost nobody asks out loud, which is where the difference went. Because somebody is holding it, you already have an explanation ready. Everybody does. It is inflation. Groceries cost more, gas costs more, the whole cart went up, and these foods went up with it. And some of that is true. Beef in general is expensive right now. The national cattle herd is the smallest it has been in about 75 years, and that pushes every beef number on the shelf upward. But inflation does not explain why a cut that was free in 1970 now beats steak at the counter, while the grits sitting next to it on the same plate cost almost exactly what they always did. 2 different things are happening under that one rising price. They are not the same thing, and telling them apart is the entire point of this video. The first thing is real scarcity. Some of these foods genuinely became harder to get for reasons a market can defend on paper. There is a hard ceiling on how much of them exists, and demand walks straight into it. The second thing is repricing. The food never got rare, and it never got harder to grow or catch. All that changed is who is selling it, what room it is being served in, and what that room is allowed to charge for it. Those 2 mechanisms feel identical when you are standing at the register holding a receipt. They could not be more different once you pull them apart. So here is how the video runs. I am going to walk the first group first, the foods that actually got scarce. Then, right in the middle, I am going to show you the one food that breaks the whole story, the one where everything you just learned about supply and demand simply stops working. That is where the video turns. After that, we walk the foods that never got expensive at all and only changed address. And then we deal with the money and with the part nobody put on a price tag. Before any of that, one honest minute on why you can trust the numbers. Because on a topic like this, the trust is the whole thing. Everything here comes from the record. Retail and wholesale price data, a lot of it straight from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which tracks the price of specific cuts of meat, week by week, by name. The documented history of what people were actually fed on plantations, and later on, sharecropping land. The trade and export data behind why certain cuts got expensive and others did not. And the food historians who spent years in the archives on exactly this, people like Adrian Miller and Michael Twitty. I am also going to be straight with you about the seams, because there are a few. Old grocery prices are patchy and regional. So when I give you a then price, treat it as the texture of a time and a place, not a national statistic carved in stone. That business of a butcher handing a cut over free was a local habit at a local shop, never a policy anywhere. And the last part of this story, the part about where the value went and who kept it, is interpretation. It is the best reading of a stack of documented facts, not a documented fact all by itself. Where a claim is solid, I will tell you it is solid. Where it is a reading, I will say so. The plain record is damning enough on its own. Inflating it would only cost me the people in the comments who fact-check me, and those people are the ones defending this channel. So, when I hand you a wholesale number, it has a year and a market attached. When I hand you a menu price, it came off a real menu. And when I hand you a reading about who profited, I will flag it as a reading before I say it, every time. Let me start with a food that has nothing to do with soul food, on purpose because it proves the mechanism somewhere neutral before I ask you to believe anything harder. Lobster. Today, lobster is the top of the menu, a luxury, a splurge, the thing you order when someone else is paying, priced like a small celebration. Now, go back to colonial New England, and it is the opposite of that in every direction. Lobster washed up on the shore in piles, drifts of it 2 feet high after a storm. It was so common and so looked down on that people fed it to prisoners, to servants, to children, to the poor, and used the rest as bait and as fertilizer for the fields. They called it the cockroach of the sea. In 1622, the governor of Plymouth Colony, William Bradford, had to apologize to a boatload of new arrivals because the only thing he could set in front of them was lobster and a cup of water. He was embarrassed by it. A century and a half later, the reputation had barely moved. A 19th century writer named John Rowan said that lobster shells piled around a house were read as a sign of poverty and degradation. People buried the shells in the yard so the neighbors would not see them. There is a stretch where a pound of lobster ran about 11 cents, while a pound of Boston baked beans ran about 53 cents. Read that again. The bean was the respectable food, 4 times the price. The lobster was what you ate when you had nothing better, and you were a little ashamed to be seen eating it. Now I owe you a seam here, because this story gets told with far too much confidence. You have heard that indentured servants had it written into their contracts that they could not be fed lobster more than a few times a week, that they rioted over it. Food historians who went looking for the hard proof, people like Sandy Oliver and the researchers Stavely and Fitzgerald, found the paper trail is thin to non-existent. What is solid is that lobster was genuinely low status and genuinely cheap, a poor man's protein, eaten mostly by people who had little say in their diet. The tidy contract detail is folklore that grew on top of a real base over the years. So, take the base, which is true, and leave the legend, which is decoration. The thing that flipped lobster was the railroad and the can. The lobster itself never got one bit better. Once the smack boats and then the railways could move it inland, and canneries could ship it to people who had never formed a single opinion about it. Those inland customers tasted it fresh, liked it, and carried no shame about it at all. Demand climbed. Then wartime economics and the glittering city restaurants finished the job, and lobster went from poverty food to delicacy and never once looked back. Same animal. New room. New price. That is the entire mechanism, start to finish, and I needed you to see it working on something that carries no other weight before we go where it actually hurts. One more detail that makes the flip almost absurd. During World War II, when the government rationed the foods people actually valued, lobster was left off the list because by then it counted as a delicacy, which meant the wealthy could eat as much of it as they wanted while other foods were scarce. In the space of a couple of generations, the exact same animal went from a food you were ashamed to be seen holding to a wartime privilege of the rich. Nothing about the lobster earned that. The story people told about it changed, and the price climbed to match the new story. Because now I can tell you what the cut from the opening was. It was oxtail, literally the tail of the animal. For most of American history, it was exactly what it sounds like. The leftover end, mostly bone and cartilage, a little meat, the piece the good cuts got separated from, and nobody upstairs wanted. On plantations, and long after emancipation, it went to the people who were handed whatever was left, and they turned it into something extraordinary. Cook that tail low and slow for hours, and the collagen packed into it melts down into a richness and a depth you simply cannot buy in a lean, expensive cut. In Jamaica, across the Caribbean, through the African and Latin American and East Asian diasporas, oxtail became a centerpiece, a Sunday dish, a taste of home. In Jamaica specifically, it traces straight back to the enslaved, who were given the snout, the foot, and the tail, and built a whole tradition out of it. And here is the fact that a market genuinely cannot argue its way around. Every animal has exactly one tail. One. It yields something like 6 to 8 pounds after it is cleaned and cut. Set that against brisket, where a single animal gives you around 29 pounds. So when demand rises across all of those communities at once, and then the wider American food scene finally catches up and wants in too, the supply physically cannot answer. There is no second tail on the cow. Now watch the number, because this one is clean. The U.S. Department of Agriculture only started tracking oxtail wholesale in 2015, and that first year, it averaged about $5.99 a pound. By the summer of 2024, that same wholesale figure was $14.19. It nearly tripled in under a decade. People who grew up cooking it remember a bag of oxtails going for around $2 a pound at the neighborhood store a generation ago. Today, in a lot of markets, oxtail per pound has caught right up to ribeye, and its longtime cooks are online only, half joking about a campaign to make oxtail cheap again. The people who ate it when it was a scrap are now priced out of it as a delicacy. That is real scarcity. It is the cleanest example on this entire list, which is exactly why it opened the video. And you can see the demand curve in something as simple as search interest. Google Trends had oxtail sitting at a popularity score of about 6 in 2004, barely a blip, and up around 73 by 2024. A straight line climbing as Caribbean and diaspora cooking moved into the mainstream through music, through social media, through every food tourism list telling people to go find the real thing. Once the wider world wanted the dish, the one tail on the animal became the whole ballgame. The chefs who put it on their menus at truffle prices did not invent that flavor. They found it already perfected in kitchens that had been coaxing it out of the cheapest possible cut for 200 years.
Before we continue, I want to show you something amazing. We put together a simple guide for the people who really care about these stories. Because whether we're talking about old school food, forgotten trade, one truth remains the same. History is disappearing. This is for anyone who believes these memories, these lessons, these ways of life are still worth keeping. You can find it in the link in the description below, or you can scan the QR code right here.
Next, the single strongest fact I have for you. Chicken wings. A wing used to be trash. That is not a figure of speech. When chickens were bought and cooked whole, which was the norm well into the last century, the wing was an afterthought. The bony part you dropped in the stock pot or threw straight out. The turn has a date and an address. In 1964, at the Anchor Bar in Buffalo, New York, a co-owner named Teresa Bellissimo fried up a batch of leftover wings late one night, tossed them in hot sauce and butter, and sent them out to her son and his friends. A later owner of that same bar put it about as plainly as anyone could in an interview years afterward. He said, "I remember when wings, they used to throw them away. Then something bigger happened to the whole bird. Through the 1980s, American shoppers swung hard toward boneless, skinless breast meat, lean and convenient, and the National Chicken Council will tell you exactly what that did to the rest of the chicken. It turned the wing into a cheap byproduct. There was suddenly a glut of them, worth almost nothing, and bars scooped them up, ran 10-cent wing nights to pull people through the door, and sold an ocean of beer alongside satellite TV football. For a while, everybody won, and then demand for the wing itself exploded, and it hit the same wall the oxtail hit. A chicken has 2 wings, and you cannot make more wings without raising more entire chickens, no matter how badly the country wants them on Super Bowl Sunday. So the once worthless part inverted the whole bird. Per pound, wings now regularly cost more than bone-in breast meat, which the Smithsonian was already writing up more than a decade ago. And it has only gotten more true. Americans eat something close to 1 billion+ servings around a single Super Bowl weekend. What used to be a $6 basket at the bar runs closer to $14 now. And after the shortages of the last few years, the price found a new floor and stayed on it. There is a final little irony baked in. As bone-in wings got expensive, restaurants invented the boneless wing, which is mostly just cut-up breast meat wearing the name of the part that got too pricey. The lowliest piece of the animal became the expensive one, purely because the cooking made people want it. And people do not just pay for wings now, they steal them. There is a documented case in Georgia of 2 men walking off with 10 pallets of wings, something like $65,000 worth, timed around a playoff run. That is what a former trash cut is worth today. The wholesale price does still swing hard. It spiked above $3 a pound in 2021 during the shortage, then fell back under $2 the next year as supply caught up. But notice what it never does. It never falls back to worthless. The floor keeps rising. Nobody's throwing wings away anymore. Now brisket, which is the same story wearing a Texas hat. Brisket comes from the chest of the animal, and it is naturally tough, a hard-working slab of muscle that supports most of the cow's weight and is packed with connective tissue. For most of the last century, that toughness made it the cheap, undesirable cut. The one that demanded 12 to 16 hours of low patient heat that nobody wanted to spend. Before brisket was even the star of Texas barbecue, the pits mostly cooked beef clawed, a leaner shoulder cut, over direct heat that was basically grilling. The shift came around the 1930s, when Texas barbecue moved to indirect, offset smoke, the fire in a separate chamber pulling heat and smoke across the meat. That low and slow method is what finally made brisket worth eating. And the labor of perfecting it, the long collagen breakdown into something that nearly falls apart, was put in by black pitmasters and working Texas cooks back when the cut was worth almost nothing at all. Then Central Texas barbecue became a national destination product. Names like Aaron Franklin turned brisket into a thing people wait in line for hours to eat and fly across the country to try. And the cut chased the fame right up the price chart. Look at the plain U.S. Department of Agriculture wholesale figure. Brisket was about $2.60 a pound in January 2020. By early 2025, it was about $6.44, and in the years since, it has kept climbing. On restaurant menus, it now lands at $35, $38, even $40 a pound at the joints that win the awards. And owners will tell you they barely make a dime on it. One award-winning Texas pitmaster told a reporter he cringes now when a customer says the word brisket because he makes his actual money on pork and sides. A Texas A&M livestock economist named David Anderson summed the whole arc up cleanly. The primal brisket, he said, used to be a very inexpensive cut, and it is now behind only the primal rib and loin in value. The cheapest thing in the case became one of the dearest. Some of that is the tight herd I mentioned, and some of it is pure fame. Both are real, and they braided together. Talk to the people actually buying it, and the jump is brutal in plain terms. One tailor, Texas pitmaster, said a 15-pound brisket that used to run him about $30 now costs him $110 to $115, and that is before 12 hours of smoke, fuel, and labor before a single slice hits the counter. The wholesale figure is up something like 189% since early 2020. Beloved barbecue joints have closed over exactly this, and Texas A&M has been running barbecue town halls for years to help pitmasters cope with the price of the one cut that made them famous. Sit with that. The dish got so popular, It started killing the businesses built on it, in the state that built the dish. Run short ribs and neck bones right alongside brisket because they are the same arc one step behind. Short ribs were a humble braising cut, cheap and fatty and slow, the kind of thing that needed hours to become tender. Neck bones were close to free, sold by the bag, the piece you used to stretch a pot of beans or a pot of greens across a whole family and most of a week. More seasoning and marrow than meat. Both did exactly what brisket and oxtail did. The instant the cooking earned respect, the cheap cut earned a price. Short ribs sit on tasting menus now under candlelight. Neck bones are not the giveaway they used to be at the meat counter. Same pattern, same engine, one beat later, and you can watch the same logic reach for the next cut in line. Beef cheek, tripe, gizzards, turkey necks, the smoked ham hock, every one of them is a cheap, tough, or overlooked piece that some cook somewhere already knows how to make sing. The market has learned the trick now. It follows the cooking. Whatever the people who were handed the leftovers figured out how to elevate, the price eventually finds it. One cut at a time, which is why long-time cooks watch these trends with a very specific kind of dread. They already know which cut is next. If you are still with me, hold that pattern in your head, because I am about to show you a food that breaks it into pieces. But first, one honest word about where all of this actually lived. Everything I just described, turning tough collagen into something tender, reading the exact minute a cut gives up its resistance, stretching a single neck bone across 6 people so nobody at that table goes to bed hungry. None of that was ever written down. Not because it was simple, but because the people doing it were not the people writing the cookbooks. It lived in the hands. It got passed from one cook to the next by standing at the same stove and watching. And it is exactly the kind of knowledge that vanishes when a generation goes quietly, with no copy left anywhere. That is the reason we put the Grandma Made Away Kitchen Collection together. To keep that hand-to-hand knowledge in one place so it does not leave with the people who still hold it. It is a mission a lot more than a product. And the link is down in the description if you want it. Okay, the food that breaks the pattern. Chitterlings, chitlins, if you grew up with them. The small intestines of the pig, cleaned by hand over hours, rinsed again and again, then boiled or stewed down for most of a day. About as humble as food gets. They come straight out of the plantation hierarchy, one of the cheapest, least wanted parts of the animal, the kind of thing sent to the quarters while the valuable cuts went the other direction, to the people who owned the place and were, as the old phrase goes, living high on the hog. Now, a seam, because the food historian Adrian Miller is careful about this one. Enslaved people did eat chitlins, but so did the white households, and the record shows enslaved cooks making them for the master's table too. So it is not a clean story of one group and one food. What is true is that chitlins became an anchor of soul food, and through the 1960s and 70s, they got held up as a cultural sacrament, a marker of who you were and where you came from. There was even a whole live music world named after them. The Chitlin Circuit. Not everyone loved the symbol. The writer Eldridge Cleaver said back in 1968 that the people who ate chitlins out of plain necessity had a very different relationship to them than the ones who ate them to make a point. Now here is where every rule from the last 15 minutes stops working. If price simply followed demand, Chitterlings should be getting cheaper every year because fewer and fewer people eat them. The taste for them is genuinely fading with each generation, and the price went up anyway, hard. In late 2022, a grocery association in Kentucky was fielding the exact question the whole community was asking, which was why a 10-pound bucket of chitlins had jumped from around $8 to around $30, in some places doubling inside a single week. The explanation had nothing to do with anyone's dinner table. It was the plant. Cleaning intestines is one of the most labor-intensive, least wanted jobs on the entire processing floor, and when the labor to do it dried up, and when plants consolidated and closed, processors simply stopped bothering with it. That material now often gets sold off cheap as a byproduct for pet food instead of being cleaned for people. So the shelf goes empty, and the little that reaches you carries the cost of a job almost nobody is willing to do anymore. And this is not a one-store fluke. It is structural. Hog plants across the country have been squeezed, some closing outright, and the whole industry has been fighting labor shortages and rising costs for years. When a plant is already under pressure, the very first thing it drops is the slow, unpleasant, low-margin work. And cleaning chitterlings by hand is close to the top of that list. So the price of a food almost nobody eats keeps climbing, driven entirely by the cost of handling it, not by anyone wanting it. That is the tell. When you see a price move that demand cannot explain, stop looking at the customer and start looking at the plant floor and the paycheck. Sit with that for a second, because it is the hinge of the whole video, the simple supply and demand story you have been running in your head. The one that explained the oxtail and the wings so neatly just failed on its face. Falling demand, rising price. Which means from here on, we have to stop asking what the customers want and start asking two different questions. Who is doing the work and who is setting the number? So let me turn the video. From this point on, the ingredient is not the thing being priced. Watch how it works. Shrimp and grits. The roots run through Gullah Geechee culture, the descendants of enslaved Africans along the Carolina and Georgia coast, and the food historian Michael Twitty traces the deeper lineage of cornmeal cooked with shellfish all the way back across the ocean to places like Mozambique, centuries before the transatlantic slave trade. On the ground in the Low Country, it was the definition of cheap by design. Grits are just ground corn, sometimes a few cups of it handed out as part of a weekly ration. The shrimp were small creek shrimp you caught yourself for nothing, with a net, off a muddy bank. Fishermen took a single pot out on the boat for a 12 or 24-hour haul, dropped in grits and whatever they pulled from the water that morning, added a little seawater, and let it cook down. They called it a one-pot. A sustaining, filling, cheap meal for people with very little. It stayed a home breakfast, a working man's dish, not a restaurant plate, for generations. The earliest written recipes for it show up in Charleston cookbooks in 1930 and 1950, transcribed by white authors from the Gullah cooks who actually made it. Then, in 1982, a chef named Bill Neal put it on the menu at Crook's Corner in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, dressed up with cheddar and Parmesan grits, mushrooms, and bacon, served as a dinner entree instead of a back porch breakfast. And in 1985, the influential food editor of the New York Times, Craig Claiborne, ate that version, loved it, and ran the recipe in the paper. That single article sent shrimp and grits national almost overnight. And by the mid-1990s, it was on fine dining menus across the South and beyond. Today, it is a signature entree in cities that had never heard of it 50 years ago. And it runs you $30 in restaurants a long way from any creek. Now look underneath the plate. The grits, the base, the actual soul of the dish still cost almost nothing. Corn is corn, and it stayed cheap. The grits underneath still cost the same few pennies they always did. Everything you are paying extra for is the plating, the tablecloth, and the zip code. That is repricing. Once you spot it here, you start spotting it on every menu you read. Pork belly, the same move, faster. Pork belly is the cheap, fatty underside of a pig, the very same slab that gets cured into bacon. For most of its life, it was a low-status cut that sold for very little, exactly the kind of fatty end that got passed down the hierarchy. Then chefs reclassified it as a chef's ingredient, gave it its own proud line on the menu, and started charging for it as a centerpiece in its own right, seared and glazed. The pig and the cut are exactly what they always were. Someone decided the room could charge for it as a headliner, and the room did. It is the exact move you watched happen to lobster and to brisket, just compressed into a few years instead of a few centuries. A humble fatty cut, a change in who is plating it, a new number on the menu, and suddenly the cheapest part of the pig headlines the dinner. Collard greens might carry the widest markup on this entire list. Raw, they are still nearly free. A bunch of collards is one of the cheapest things in the whole produce section, and it always has been. This was survival food, tough leaves cooked down long and slow, with a piece of cheap pork to feed a family for pennies. Then, about a decade ago, the food world rebranded them. Georgia's own agricultural researchers were writing about a collard boom. Chefs like Hugh Acheson putting them on fine dining menus, cooks using them as wrappers and chips and slaws, and everybody suddenly pointing out that collards are, by the numbers, denser in certain nutrients than kale, a superfood all at once, and served as a premium side at a markup wider than almost anything else here, because the raw cost barely moved a cent, and the menu price jumped anyway. This is the purest repricing on the list, because there is no scarcity story to hide behind it all. Nobody can claim collards got rare. You can buy a mountain of them for a few dollars this afternoon. The entire price difference between the cheap bunch in the store and the premium side on the plate is a story someone decided to tell about the same leaf. Then catfish, which adds one more twist on top, the imported swap. Catfish came free from the river first, then got farmed across the South into a genuine regional industry, then became a priced commodity that a lot of black families and black-owned restaurants built their tables and their businesses around. But here is the modern turn. So much cheaper imported fish flooded into the country, especially swai and basa from Vietnam, sold for years under the name catfish. That in 2003 Congress had to pass a law saying only American catfish could legally be labeled catfish at all. Around 90% of the imported product was coming from overseas, and it is not even held to the same inspection rules. So walk into a southern restaurant today and you will often see it laid right out on the menu. Real domestic catfish priced high, 3 pieces for north of $30, and the imported sway sitting right underneath it at a fraction of that. The cheaper fish quietly took the plate, and catfish kept the high price it had spent decades teaching the market to expect, while the people and the fish that built that expectation got undercut in their own house. And the customer usually cannot even tell. The whole reason for the 2003 labeling law was that so many diners were paying catfish prices for a completely different imported fish and never knowing the difference. The name did the selling. The dish that black Southern families turned into a staple became a price point that an imported product could quietly step into and cash out. So the pattern is now impossible to miss. Shrimp and grits, pork belly, collards, catfish. Not one of them changed rooms because the food itself got better. They changed rooms because somebody realized what the room could charge for them. Which brings us, finally, to the money. Where did the difference go? Go back to the plantation and later to the sharecropping land. And understand one thing clearly. The division of the hog and the steer was never about taste, and it was never random. It was hierarchy written directly into who ate what. The loin, the ribs, the roasts, the valuable primal cuts went in one direction to the people who owned the land and the animals. What was left, the tail, the feet, the neck, the intestines, the fatty belly, the bony ends, went to the quarters and the field kitchens. And the black cooks there were expected to take the bottom of that hierarchy and turn it into something that would keep a family alive through a whole winter. They did it over generations, and that is precisely the labor no price tag has ever once accounted for. It was skilled work disguised as chores. Knowing how long to soak a salted cut, how to build flavor out of an onion, and a little vinegar and thyme. How to make a bony neck read as a full meal. That is culinary technique by any honest definition. It just never got called that because the people doing it were not the people who got to hand out the titles. Then the Great Migration carried those dishes north into Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and New York, into corner kitchens and church basements and family stoves on cold blocks 1,000 miles from the coast. And decades after that, the restaurant industry found them, and the wider country decided they were worth real money. Value accumulated on top of them, but it did not accumulate where the food came from, because the people who created the cuisine did not own the land, or the animals, or the storefronts, or eventually, even the recipes with their names on them. The cooking traveled north with the people. What did not travel with it was ownership of any of it. And ownership is the whole game. Because ownership is where the value lands and stays. The cook who perfects a dish and the company that trademarks it are standing in two different economic worlds. One gets the love and the memory. The other gets the margin. For most of this history, the people who did the cooking were structurally locked out of a second world, first by law, then by land, then by capital. So the cuisine could go everywhere while the wealth it generated stayed put, somewhere else. I want to be careful and fair right here, because this last part is the reading, not the receipt. There is no single villain in a back room here, no plot against a community. What there is instead is something more ordinary and, honestly, a lot harder to fix than a villain would be. It was the everyday machinery of a country that was glad to eat the food and slow to pay the cook who invented it. Nobody has to sign a single document for value and credit to come apart from each other. They drift apart on their own, quietly, year after year, unless somebody insists on dragging them back into the same frame. And the way through it was never grievance. It is accuracy, the plain work of getting specific about where the value was actually made and by whom. So let me leave you with the reframe, because I do not want you walking away from this beaten. I want you walking away clear, and I want you walking away proud. The point is not only that the money went somewhere else, although it plainly did. The point is what those cooks actually pulled off. Handed the worst of what the animal had to offer, working under a constraint that would have broken almost anyone alive. They produced a cuisine so good that the market itself eventually came back for it, hat in hand. Hold on to that, because it flips the whole feeling of the story. The tail, the wings, the neck, and the belly became expensive for one reason. The cooking was extraordinary enough to make the entire rest of the country want in on it. Call it what it was. Real engineering done under pressure by people who understood these animals better than the ones who kept the loin ever did. So read the price of an oxtail today the right way. It is the market admitting, 60 years late and in dollars, that these cooks were right all along. They were solving a hard technical problem, over and over, with the worst raw material anyone could hand them. And they solved it so well that the solution outlived the whole system that forced it on them. When you pay $14 a pound for oxtail, that is what you are actually paying for. 200 years of figuring out what to do with a tail nobody else wanted. And if you want the kind of knowledge that turned a discarded cut into food worth paying $30 for, the technique that lived in the pot and in the hands and never once made it into anybody's published cookbook, that is exactly what the Grandma Made Away Kitchen Collection is for. Kept in one place, on purpose, so it does not leave with the generation that still carries it. The link is down in the description. Now I want to hear from you, because every single one of you walked into this video with a number already sitting in your head. So tell me the one that got you. Name the food, tell me the price you paid the last time you bought it, and then tell me what your grandmother paid for it. All three. In the comments, I read them, and this section is going to be worth reading. And when you are done, go watch the one on how black families fed 6 people on almost nothing. Because that is the other half of this exact story, the side where the constraint turned into pure genius at the stove. Night after night, out of nothing anyone else wanted, they gave these foods away because they were certain they were worthless. And the people who took them proved the opposite so completely that the whole country came back and put a price on it. The animal never changed. The cooking never changed. The only things that ever moved were the price and the name on the bill.